Your father's Oldsmobiles, coming up next. Hi, this is Adam. Welcome to my Rare Classic Car channel. Today we have your father's Oldsmobiles. This 1975 Delta 88 Royale versus this 1967 Delta 88. So back when these cars were produced, getting a mid-price luxury car meant that you still got a big machine. Bigger was better. And more specifically, something that was generally longer, lower, and wider was preferred to something that was narrow and tall. So although only 8 years separate these vehicles, there's quite a few differences and a lot happened in this time frame. The first is that the cars grew. So this 1967 Delta 88 that you see rides on a 123-inch wheelbase, and it's about 216 inches long. And as you come to 1975, this 1975 Oldsmobile had grown. The wheelbase was up an inch to 124 inches, and the overall length was up to almost 226 inches. So it's adding close to a foot in overall length versus the car that's came in 1967. Now a lot of that is because of these bumpers. You notice how big these railroad tie bumpers are on the 75 compared to how nice and integrated the bumpers are on the 67. Well, in 1972, the first year of federally mandated bumper standards came into place, mandating a 2.5 mile an hour impact standard in the front, nothing in the rear, which meant that the car had to crash head on into a solid barrier at that speed and not have any damage sustained. Then as the years went on, in 1973, the standard in the front became 5 miles an hour, up from 2.5, and the back had a standard of 2.5 miles an hour impact. So 73 was the first year for a rear impact standard. Then in 74, the standard went to 5 miles an hour in both front and rear. And consequently, you get these big so-called railroad tie bumpers that are often set pretty far away from the body in order to enable deflection and no damage, along with these big rub strips. And on this car, just to even further help with the deflection, this grille is spring-loaded, so it can deflect and push back in the event of a crash. So in addition to the overall length, this car from 1967 and as it progressed into 1975, it gained a lot of weight and became pretty corpulent by 1975. So this car here, the 75 88 Royale, weighs about 4,600 pounds. This 1967 model weighs just about 4,000 pounds. So 15% more weight in the 75. And at the same time that the car was gaining weight and putting on pounds, it started losing horsepower. So this 75 88 is powered by a 455 cubic inch 4-barrel motor at 190 horsepower, whereas the 67 is powered by a 425 cubic inch V8. And this one in particular is the no-cost economy engine option. But the standard in the Delta 88s was a 425 cubic inch premium fuel 2-barrel V8 making 300 gross horsepower. Now, rough rule of thumb, converting gross horsepower to net horsepower, which is what cars are rated in today, and all cars have been rated in since 1972, that 300 gross horsepower you multiply by about 70% is about 210 horsepower. So this car has about 20 more horsepower and 600 less pounds than this car, in spite of having a smaller engine. Both have GM's excellent turbohydromatic 400 transmission in them, although in 1967 the turbohydromatic 400 still had what was called a switch pitch feature, which means that there was a 2-speed torque converter. So there were different stall speeds depending on if you were under heavy acceleration. A switch under hood would change the stall speed in the torque converter and raise it from about 1900 RPMs to 2200, I believe. So you get a little bit more power. And after the 1967 model year, GM discontinued the switch pitch in its turbohydromatic 400 transmissions and 425 transmissions, and just went to one stall speed, so which is about 2,000 RPMs on this. So it was nice in 67. You had two different stall speeds depending on if you were looking for economy or power, and this transmission is just amazing. Gives you a little bit of extra passing power when you want, and when you don't want it, it's operating in economy mode. This one is kind of operating in a hybrid, I guess, state all the time. And you may chuckle at me saying economy mode on a big 67 car like this, but truth be told, you know, this Oldsmobile here gets the 75, gets about 15 miles per gallon freeway. And this 67 gets about 16, 17. So really not bad mileage. These both have quite tall rear ends in them, 256 rear ends. So they're highway cruisers and have highway gears. So as the years went on, unfortunately, the weight gain happened, power dropped. 75 was also the first year for the catalytic converter on these vehicles. And as the automakers were trying to figure out emissions, it helped. But it took a few more years. 75, at least for General Motors vehicles, and Ford vehicles too, tends to be the nadir of the performance years. It starts kind of coming up from that point, but in 1975, the base Corvette motor made 145 horsepower, and the optional engine, I believe, made 165, the L82. There was no big block left in the Corvettes in 1975. So just to give you a reference point, 190 horsepower, that was a lot back in the day. So if we compare some of the interior features, or maybe even just let's take a look at the exterior and the body fits and gaps. So, you know, by 1975, GM's quality was starting to go downhill, and you can see in this car, the body gap here, you know, is just not that great and uniform. Pretty big body gap here. You can see the different bump stops on both sides of the car as you look up the fender line. This gap on the doors between the quarter panel and the passenger door, you can stick your pinky finger part of the way through to the first knuckle. It's so big. But it's not that the door has moved forward. This gap over here is also big. It's just that the sheet metal was not formed correctly. And you walk around the car, and unfortunately the 75 just doesn't seem to have that quality that some of the earlier vehicles did. You know, everything from those body fits I was just mentioning to how the doors close. If you watch, you know, I'll open, this door actually closes with really no effort, but watch all the trim and the glass jiggle here as I close it. Oh, I'll close it with a little more effort. And you can see the seat kind of wobble here. Ford used to actually advertise for some of their vehicles in this time frame, hardly any seat wobble. Whereas this one, watch what happens. You can kind of see the seat jiggle around. In contrast, if we look at the Oldsmobile and you look at the gaps here, they're noticeably narrower, although still big by contemporary standards, quite straight here, and actually tighter gap over here. The door fit in this area isn't bad. The trunk fit isn't as bad. I wouldn't call this car super well put together, but I would say that it's, well, put together better than its successor. And some things, similar things apply as we turn to the interior. So take a look at the door panel and the chrome pieces. This is a pretty plain door panel in terms of being non-controversial, but it's nicely trimmed. Has some nice stainless pieces to it. And as you get inside the car, you have all of this chrome trim on the pillars all the way back. Beautiful ribbed headliner here. Although this is faux wood grain on the dash, it is pretty convincing and looks luxurious. This isn't like some of the later wood grains that really just scream that they are fake. And all of the switchgear in here and this silkscreen lettering, it just screams quality. I mean, when you push this button, it has such a distinctive noise, sounds substantial. Automakers even put a lot of effort into the steering wheels back in these days. And this is just a beautiful wheel with this red center, a 1-year only wheel. You know, it's plastic, the horn buttons here. Nice horn. All the switchgear just is so nice. The turn signal is unique, feels good. The gear shift lever, so everything you touch in this car, even the door handle's beautifully sculpted. And the doors close with, you know, great sound. There's a little bit of glass wobble, but overall, this 67 just exudes quality in many ways, or at least more quality than its successor. It's not controversial in its styling, but it is, I would say, handsome. Even the bench seats, this is a base Delta 88, but look at how nice, you know, you get this fully stitched, actually stitched seat pattern. Beautiful seatbelt buckles that'll burn you on a hot summer day. I mean, this thing, if you wanted to assault somebody, this probably weighs almost, I don't know, a pound. Something you're never going to see anymore in cars with how conscious they are about weight. So let's check out the cabin of the 88 Royale. And by the way, this Royale is a higher trim line. This was the top Delta 88. This would be equivalent to the Delta 88 Custom in 67. So the first thing is you've got the annoying key buzzer by this year, which everybody loves. But the door panel has become a kind of a shadow of its former self. The full soft touch panel door that was on the 67 now has this hard plastic armrest area and lower. This area up here is soft touch, but just doesn't have the same rich look and this kind of faux gold leafing. It looks okay. I wouldn't say it looks overly convincing. Similar inside, as I look at the dash panel, this faux wood grain just doesn't appear as rich as the faux wood grain on the 67. I can't believe I'm commenting about faux wood grains looking richer than the other, but I am, and I at least think it's a fair statement. But in spite of this, you know, not, I would say, being the best effort, you notice the chrome trim is lost here. The headliner isn't quite as nice. It is still a ribbed headliner. You, of course, have shoulder belts by this year. Doesn't feel like it's quite as nice of a place to be, but it's still not a bad place to be. Especially in this Royale interior with these velour seats. They are supremely padded, extremely comfortable. The comfort factor on this car, I would say, is much higher than the 67. The bench seat is a bit upright, not overly comfortable, has quite a bit of padding, but in spite of its padding, seems to not be all that comfortable. I would say it's okay for any intermediate rides, but if I had to take a 7 or 8 hour ride in that car, I don't know that I'd get out and feel relaxed and refreshed. Whereas in this 88, there is no lumbar support. There's nothing holding you into the seat, you know, but the Velcro-like velour here, which sticks in and hooks to your clothes, this car is very comfortable and very spacious. No center console. Still has, you know, the one thing is it still has a huge gas pedal. This is a floating gas pedal, by the way, by this year. It's stuck in the floor mat there, but the other one is hinged at the floor in the 67. 67 gas pedal is even bigger than that, but gosh, I wish they made gas pedals that big. Just looks very commanding. Same with the brake pedal. Take a look at that. So maybe not quite as nice as a cabin, but a very comfortable cabin. And this vehicle in particular, this 75 Olds 88, has quite the option list, including the firm ride and handling package. Let's take a look under the hood and see both of these power plants. By the way, you notice, gosh, this door sound and closure just, anybody who's driven one of these GM cars from this era knows that sound. Ford did the door closures so much better. Chryslers were, I would say, better than GM too on door closures. But here's the big 455 7.5 liter V8 for those of you who are outside the US, making all of 190 horsepower, which doesn't sound like a lot, but it is 360, I believe, foot-pounds of torque or thereabouts. So it's quite a bit of torque. Almost like a modern-day diesel engine torque curve, too. The horsepower peak is at sub 4,000 RPM, whereas the horsepower peak, even with the two-barrel on this, is in the mid-4,000 range. So the engines just have different power characteristics. This one is much more of a rever, even though it has a two-barrel. This one, even though it's a four-barrel, you could almost have it powered by a two-barrel. It doesn't rev. The motor's not ingesting a lot of air. Yes, it's bigger, but you probably could get away with a two-barrel that was almost as effective. And in fact, Olds did. In 71, the 88 came with a 455 two-barrel standard, if you can believe that. So this year also the 350 in 1975, the 350 V8 was 170 horsepower, so you only got 20 more horsepower, although you did get 90-ish more pound-feet of torque when you went from the 350 to the 455. But the turbohydromatic 400 transmission that's behind the 455 uses about 40 horsepower to power it, for lack of a better term. And the turbohydromatic 350 behind the 350 cubic inch motors uses about 25 horsepower. So the rear wheel horsepower difference isn't all that much different between the 455 and 350. And if we look under the hood of this motor, or under the hood of the 67, the 425, you can see it's also nicely packaged. Again, this is just a two barrel. But a couple interesting things you'll notice. For those of you who've been watching my channel for some time, you'll hear that I talk about the GM Jiggle of the 71 to 76 generation and how they're so much more jiggly than the previous 65 to 70 generation. And you can see the engineers were trying to get rid of this jiggliness, partly caused by a relatively flimsy frame and the body's getting bigger, everything getting a bit heavier. So notice in this engine compartment what you have. Structural braces from the firewall to the fender on either side. Structural braces here from the fender down into, probably better to see here, down into the lower part of where the bumper would absorb impacts. And even underneath this car, I'll take a separate video, there's a structural brace from the frame that runs from that part of the frame up to the front part of the frame. So notice in this 67, there's none of that. There's no bracing here, no bracing here, and trust me when I say there's no bracing in the front area of the frame. So it's interesting to me, each GM division had, in the 71 to 6 generation, had their way of trying to get rid of the GM Jiggle, as I call it. Cadillac had braces here and then another brace coming to the radiator support. Pontiac had a brace that went from the firewall to the wheelhouse. Oldsmobile couldn't use that because the wheelhouse on this car is plastic. Oldsmobile was a pioneer in using plastic wheelhouses, a rather ingenious design, because that's where all the road salt and debris gets kicked up. Why not make it out of plastic? It's a great idea. But this is basically the same V8 engine design, just different displacements. And they are both wonderfully smooth motors. So let me start them up for you and you can hear. We'll try the, people seem to love my reach in the window start, so here we go. And this car's cold, you can see the cold lights on. Starts right up. Boy, the domestic companies sure made great motors in this time frame. When you drive something like this, and then you drive a modern car, you almost hate to get in the modern car. Let's try this one. So similarly smooth and quiet. Just wonderful, magnificent engines. You can barely even hear the exhaust on this car. And this one's cold, so the fast idle's still on. We'll shut both of these off, and we'll take a look at the trunks. Oh, I don't have the right trunk key on here, but this car does have power trunk release, which is located in the glove box. So let me take 10 minutes to walk around the car. Open the glove box, and there's the button. Now what's humorous to me is, in spite of this car growing in size, the trunk is the same cubic feet. It's about 20 cubic feet in this car, and in this 67 it's 20 cubic feet as well. So let's take a look. Just cavernous. And this one, I still have the last license plate that was on it before I bought it, 1978 Minnesota. This Delta 88 has 15,000 miles on it, and the black one has 4,000 miles. So really two just wonderful cars, although they do have their flaws. The other thing I would say that's interesting about these cars is that in the context of the opposing GM divisions, Oldsmobiles actually were set up to be quite good handling cars. So on this 67, the roll bar in the front, or the stabilizer bar, is almost an inch in diameter. Other GM divisions generally were about 3/4 of an inch. And this car has heavier duty spring rates than some other GM divisions, including Pontiac, which was supposed to be the sporting division. By this year, the stabilizer bars were pretty much the same across most of the GM divisions at 0.94 inches. But Oldsmobile had a unique approach in that it computer matched the springs to the engine and transmission and vehicle content options, whereas other divisions didn't. So Pontiac had, I think, maybe 4 different spring rates. Oldsmobile had a lot more. You got a computer matched spring rate to the vehicle that you ordered, and because this has the ride and handling package, it also has stiffer duty shocks. And I'm not sure, I haven't found specifications on the stabilizer bars. It may have heftier stabilizer bars too. But two wonderful father's Oldsmobiles, interestingly both with these faux wire wheel hubcaps. So let's take them for a drive. So here we are in the 1967 Oldsmobile, and as you close the door and sit in the driver's seat, the first impression that you get is just one of richness. You look everywhere you look around, things look expensive, from all of this chrome trim to the beautiful ribbed headliner. It's a nice dash. It's a handsome, uneventful dash, but it is handsome. And this killer red wheel. So let's start it up. And as it starts, you start, I guess, reminiscing about the past in some ways and how some elements of these cars were better. Yes, than modern cars. Yes, modern cars accelerate faster, brake better, are safer. But this car just does everything so well. The motor is perfectly smooth and silent, and one of the things I hate about modern cars is you're either getting now an 8, 9, 10-speed transmission or a CVT, and when you drive a modern car and then you get into this, you realize that those modern transmissions just stink. I mean, they're endlessly hunting. There's almost a 1-second delay between when you put your foot on the gas pedal and something happens, especially if you got a turbocharged car. Because now with the fuel economy standards and the emission standards, the computer basically has to trim all the fuel back, the ignition timing back, execute a downshift, ramp the fuel and ignition timing back up, especially as they've been trying to make transmissions lighter weight and be able to withstand increased horsepower. So in order to do that, you have to have the transmission not stressed when it's shifting. And it just means that in order to do that, you have to have all of those different steps take place. Cutting the fuel, retarding the ignition timing, and then execute the shift. Then once the shift is executed, ramping those back up. And if you've got a turbocharged car, like something with a turbocharged 2-liter 4-cylinder, then you got to wait for the turbo to spool back up. So it's just not the same experience. Whereas this, if you step on the gas pedal, so long as your carburetor is working well, it's just instant torque, instant power. The motor doesn't rev at all. It sounds great going about its work. Really doesn't leave anything to be desired. And 3 speeds for the transmission is more than enough for this motor with all of its torque. You step on the gas if you need a little bit of passing power. It doesn't have to downshift most of the time. And if it does downshift, it's only one downshift. And it's executed very quickly. So just effortless power. That's about half throttle. The other feeling you get when you're in the 67 is, while the springs are stiffer than some of the other GM divisions, it still is a very composed ride, and it's actually a good handler. As I turn this corner, I'm not sensing a lot of leaning. You know, if I were driving a, let's call it late 60s, early to mid 70s era Ford, you would feel the lean going into any corner. It's just a different suspension philosophy. This car, in terms of suspensions, kind of similar to some of the Chryslers of the era in terms of its roll stiffness and I would say overall feel, but it is more composed than Chrysler's and less intrusiveness in terms of the bumps into the cabin, probably aided by the fact that this is a full body on frame vehicle and the Chryslers this time were all unibody, including the Imperials, which lost their body on frame in 1966. So some of you have detected I don't have too many Mopars. That's true. I do have some that I haven't featured yet, which are fuselage era Chryslers, my favorite. But I do find Chryslers to be a bit more crude than GM and Ford vehicles of the time. Although they do have excellent engine and transmissions and they do have good handling. It's just a personal preference. So if you like handling versus ride and you want excellent motors and transmissions, there's nothing wrong with Chryslers. For me, I tend to like the softer sprung rides of these big cars, the isolation, the quietness, And so I have the vehicles that I have. In any event, let's go hop into the 75 Olds. All right, here we are in the 75 Olds, and getting in the 75 after being in the 67, it's a nice place to be, but it just doesn't have that same interior quality that the 67 does. Although by this year, they redid the dashboard for the GM full-size cars in 74, and this dash does feel richer than the 71-2 generation, which has more of a driver-oriented cockpit, and I would say a bit cheaper materials. At least by this year, the Royale here has some nice cloth on the door. It is soft touch like it was in earlier years up here. It does feel like they put a little bit of money back into the interior with the 74 redo. Let's start it up and go for a ride. So the first impression of starting the motor up is, gosh, this is also, just as smooth as the 67, if not maybe a little smoother. They're both so quiet. And this motor, now that I've rebuilt the carburetor in it, sometimes I find myself thinking it's stalled out on me as I come coasting to a stoplight. I mean, it is that silent. This car has all the stock single exhaust with the muffler and resonator. I would say this motor is even a little bit smoother than the 67, and it has different power characteristics. Even though the 67 is a 2-barrel motor, it's more of a rever than this one. This one, if you step on the gas real hard, unfortunately with the 190 horsepower, it's not going to move with the greatest level of alacrity. And yet, around town and stoplight to stoplight or stop sign to stop sign, it feels very powerful. You barely touch the gas pedal and you're whisking away from a stop light. And it does so silently and effortlessly. The transmission on this one also shifts earlier than the 67, probably because of the power characteristics. Gotta love that old school metallic sound turn signal. But if you get on it here, just in terms of half throttle, it still has good power, but it doesn't feel quite as powerful as the 67. The other thing you notice is as you go over some washboard surfaces in this 75, the dash has a little bit of jiggle to it. Although I will say that the Oldsmobile seems to have less jiggle than the other GM divisions that I've driven. I'm not getting, the dash quivers. This road has got a lot of frost heaves in it. And this dash isn't being too noisy. Some of the other GMs of this generation I've driven do get quite upset by this, even with low miles. I will say the seats in this car, oh my God, they are supremely comfortable. I could take an 8-hour trip in this car and feel relaxed and refreshed when I exited. Much, much more comfortable than the 67. On a 1 to 10 scale, I would grade the 67 bench seat from a comfort standpoint at a 5. I'd put this split bench at a 9. They just don't make seats like this with this kind of foam padding anymore. But it really is just a pleasant place to be, still in the cabin. The steering on this car seems to respond a little bit more quickly than the 67. I think the steering gear went from being a fixed 17.5 to 1 ratio in 67 to a variable ratio of about 16 to 1 on average in this 75. So it's variable ratio. The more you turn it, the faster the wheels turn. I will say, compared to the earlier 71 to 6 GM generation cars that I've driven, this 455 seems to have about the same level of torque and scoot off the line, but when you step on it, it just doesn't have quite as much response. It has good response, but the other ones, the 71 Tornado, for instance, net horsepower was 275 net horsepower. So 275 net horsepower versus this at 190, and this is a heavier car. That said, it's a very pleasant place to be, pleasant ride. Just different from the 67 in terms of the torque curve, the horsepower, the largesse, if you will, of the car. The visibility in this 71 to 6 generation is excellent with these toothpick A-pillars and how they wrap around. But it just doesn't quite feel as special, even though this is the Royale and the 67 was just the Delta, not the Delta Custom. In any event, I hope that you enjoyed this trip down memory lane, experiencing a couple of your father's Oldsmobiles. Thanks for watching.